Take a moment and try and picture this in your mind. You're in your late 20s, early 30s. You are back in your hometown. It's kind of the peak of summer. You're sitting in your childhood bedroom at the edge of your bed, smoking a cigarette. You have these like old letters and CDs lying all around you. Cleaning your bedroom, I guess, just looking through old stuff, trying to get rid of some stuff. And you end up just sitting there smoking a cigarette, looking out the window, feeling that summer breeze, maybe a bit of sweat dripping out, and you remember all of these people that you grew up with. You put on one of those CDs and maybe like this old player you have lying around that you didn't think it would even work, and you have this like really old song that brings back like these weird memories that you haven't thought about in the longest time. And all these people, they haven't aged a day in your memory, but in reality you're the one who's kind of grown old and lived this whole life. But when you think about those people, they're still the same as the moment when you left them. And this is the exact feeling in, I guess, a small moment that I get from reading Murakami's books and his works. And this is the kind of, I guess, snapshot feeling of what I felt when I first read Haruki Murakami's Hear the Wind Sing, which is his first debut novel, and also when I reread this last month to kind of re-review it for you guys. I was quite, I'm not gonna lie, this video has been a lot harder than a lot of my other videos to sit down and film, because whenever I like hype myself up to do something, it becomes a little bit harder. But I've been reading Murakami's books for a while now. I guess I first read this in 2018, 2019, but I read his works way before then. So I think one of the first ones I read was Norwegian Wood back in 2016, and then I read Kafka on the Shore, Wine a Bird Chronicle. So now I feel like I've read most of his books, and I'm a lot more familiar not only with his kind of lifetime of work, but also in general a lot of criticism around it. Up until that point, living in India, I read a lot of Indian fiction, a lot of Indian books and authors. I also read a ton of classics, American and British authors. I wasn't really venturing out that much into Asian literature, Southeast Asian literature, East Asian literature. So ever since, I've read a lot of Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean books and authors, and I feel that having developed I guess more a rounded approach towards reading, or like a better, I guess, understanding of different writing styles, I'm in a better place now to talk about whether or not I just liked Murakami because it was new to me and something that I hadn't experienced, or just in general be more critical about my feelings and perception of his work. It's been a hit or miss, I won't lie. Most of them hits. Like, some of his books are my absolute favorites of all time, and some of them I didn't enjoy as much. It's mostly been a positive response from my end, but I did want to go back and also share that experience of rereading his book. I'm going to start with the first one and then go one by one and just give you a more deep dive critical approach, because I do feel like at some point he became a part of my aesthetic, where it's like I talk so much about him back in 2019, 2020, and if it is going to be a part of my identity on the internet, I want to maybe put out there some critique or just general thoughts that are actually truly reflective of how I feel, having read a lot more since. So I hope that gives you an idea of like what this whole series is. I guess I should just start with like why I like Murakami's work in general. I feel like a lot of his work is just total vibes. Like, there's a lot of feeling of nostalgia. Even though I didn't grow up in Japan, I've said this in a previous video, I didn't even like visit Japan until 2019. So like for me, I didn't know much about it, but he has this ability to talk about youth, love, and the transient kind of nature of human relationships, loneliness, all of that in a way that like doesn't really matter what culture you're from, doesn't really, you know, matter what kind of life experiences you've had. I think a lot of people can relate. I didn't really know that this was a thing, but apparently there's a word for it called magical realism, and it basically means that, you know, it's not really fantasy because some parts are real. So he talks about real life and real stories, but by that I mean like he says stories which feel very real, but they have magical elements to it. So it's like me saying I'm going about my day and suddenly the fridge opened its own kind of thing and the hand came out and gave me a cup of milk or something, you know, like it just comes out of nowhere. But this small insertions of surreal things gives the whole writing a very like dreamlike feeling. You almost feel like you're in this like fever dream sometimes when reading his books, and you don't know what's real and what's not. And to me, that is a lot more captivating than like fantasy has ever been. And I guess magical realism is not for everyone, and I see why not, because I feel like fantasy is not really my thing. So I totally respect when people say like magical realism is not really their thing, and they would much rather be fully immersed into stories that are fully fantastical. To me, something else that is very Murakami, I guess two things, is this very like non-linear plot. And like having read all of his books, I still feel like this is probably one of the strongest books, because it's so like the three things, that feeling of nostalgia and dreamlikeness, then the second thing of having this like no plot, okay, like this non-linear plot where he's just like throwing scenes and stories, but it makes so much sense. And then the last thing is like the quirky characters. I'm not someone who easily develops feelings or starts liking characters in a book. It actually takes me a lot of effort to ever care about any character in a book. So it's very rare for me to have that feeling. And apart from this book, obviously the Rat J, I'll go more detail into the plot in the book later, but like the characters in this book are so quirky and so like, I don't know, it just made me care for them. And apart from this book, I don't really have that feeling with a lot of... Why are you barking? Come join me, come on. Apart from this one, I feel like the other book where I loved the characters was the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. But yeah, the characters are also very, very unique for me to how kind of Murakami writes them. And a lot of the times, like, they don't even have names. They don't have a lot to them. Like, he doesn't build them out to be anything but just like a way of telling a particular narrative, a story, which, like, it's strange that I then relate to them more than like fully fleshed out characters in books. Explain that to me. Rereading this book was actually a really pleasant surprise, because, you know, having talked so much about Murakami, I do get targeted by a lot of people, other people talking about Murakami's books, and I've heard a lot of their criticisms and things they have to say, and it's not like I agree or disagree. I think everyone has a very different experience with reading books. That's why it's nice to kind of have these conversations online and present our ideas. But this was a pleasant surprise, because I went back to it and actually, like, I still, despite knowing what criticisms people had, I still enjoyed it thoroughly, and I felt the same way I did when I first read it. So for me, it just kind of solidified the thing that it wasn't because I was young or naive or anything like that. I actually genuinely really enjoyed and also currently enjoy his writing, and it's also as unique to me now when I'm reading it as it was to me like hundreds of books ago. So yeah, that was very reassuring. And the writing style in this book is pretty simple. I feel like if you read the prologue, where Murakami goes into quite a lot of detail into his writing process, his early life, the prologue is called My Kitchen Table Books or something like that, which is also a chapter in his autobiography called The Novelist as a Vocation. This, The Birth of My Kitchen Table Fiction. This is probably something that I read so many times, and possibly a few pages of just pure, like, I don't even know, like, it's brilliant. Just hearing about his kind of journey towards writing and the life he was living. I don't know if this is like marketing in the 1970s, so he created the story of, if it's entirely true, but it's really, really good. And he talks a little bit about his writing process, on how he first wrote in Japanese, and he was trying to follow these like conventional styles of writing and expectations, but then he took a step back, took out his old typewriter and started writing it in English, which forced him to be a lot more simplistic with his writing, and then translated back to Japanese, which made it even simpler and short and more concise. And I feel like this simplistic way of writing really, like, I love it because there is so little said, so much said in so little words, and it makes every single sentence, every single kind of thought a lot more punchy. Another thing, which I think this isn't really like rare of Murakami, I don't know if it was back in the day, I think this is more about kind of Japanese culture and writing, that there is this like really beautiful appreciation for the mundane parts of life and the ordinary aspects of life, where you get to follow these characters as they're doing pretty mundane things. They like, you never really go through like huge, like, okay, yeah, that's not entirely true. At least in this book, nothing really happens, but you get through these regular cadence of him going to the bar and living out his like day to day. The whole book takes place in 18 days from the beginning to the end, and you just get to learn his like regular, I guess, schedule, but you learn so much throughout that. But what I'm trying to get to is, because it's a first person narrative, and on top of that you are getting to basically follow someone's like day to day, you suddenly have this ability to get this really up close and personal with someone and get into their lives and get a real understanding of like what their thought process is, what their perception is through the conversations. It feels very intimate, this style of writing, to me. People sharing their mundane lives and slow living moments. I personally love to consume that, and I guess me reading Murakami kind of showed me like what I truly enjoyed, because I wasn't really exposed to that kind of living and that kind of I guess way of being before that. I do want to give you a little read on the plot. It is Haruki Murakami's debut novel. Like I said, it was published in 1979, and the story follows an unnamed narrator, like most of his other books do as well. And this is about his kind of summer that he spends back at home, where he spends a lot of this time in a bar, like a jazz bar, and the bartender or bar slash owner, he's just Jay, that's how they call him, refer to him, and it's just him, Jay, and his friend the rat, which his friend also doesn't have a name, but it's a very important character because both Jay and the rat, as they call him, make a lot of appearances throughout different books. I think the last book where he makes an appearance is like The Wild Sheep Chase, which by the way was also a fantastic read. But yeah, it's not like it's just an introduction to that character, and you wouldn't believe like where it goes. Actually, I think kind of reading those books and coming back and reading this, I can definitely see, but first reading it, I would have had no idea where the story was going. So even though it's a standalone read, I feel like a lot of his work is like interwoven. There's a lot of Easter eggs everywhere, which makes things a lot more exciting. The only other important character I would say is the girl that the narrator meets at the bar, and she's kind of like a bit passed out, so he helps her get home, and they have this kind of like situationship going. But yeah, it is important. I'll get to that later, but not as important as him and the rat, because she kind of disappears after this book. Murakami himself over time has claimed to be a fan of Kafka's work, and I feel like a lot of people might see elements of existentialism in his work, which I don't think it's like a far like reach. I do think a lot of the times his work is very, very dark, but I think what it explores more so is that what it's like to be so young and experience such a deep feeling of loss. Because if you know about like Japanese culture, a lot of young people are surrounded by a lot of loss and death, and the way they cope with this is very different. I think another thing to keep in mind when reading this book is that sexuality and the way people view sexuality is very different in Japan and compared to the rest of the world. To me, the way Murakami writes characters gives me this feeling of like impermanence that I feel like is a very big theme in his book, where he doesn't even get to know anyone properly. Like even when he's talking about people, or like, it's not so much that he doesn't flesh out character, he shows the disinterest of the main protagonist in the people around him, because he feels like they're gonna be here today and gone tomorrow. He takes a deep interest in trying to understand how they're thinking, or like why they are the way they are, but like at the same time doesn't put any effort to actually getting to know them anymore, because like he has all these questions, but you can see this like fight like I guess this inner kind of thing that he's experiencing, where he wants to know all these answers to these questions and get to know these people, form a closer bond, but at the same time he's struggling, but he's trying to maintain a distance so he can protect himself from getting hurt in the case that they also disappear from his life. Which I think like you only understand that when you felt a great sense of loss or disappointment in people who are close to you. Otherwise it's really hard concept to kind of wrap your head around. There's a lot of kind of this dwelling on lost memories, lost opportunities, people, I guess even the past, and all of this is just to say that there could be so much, you know, deeply rooted in people that they don't really realize unless they start looking within themselves and into their past, which is not always a bad thing to do. I think people nowadays are just like kind of go, go, go. They don't really take the time. They're so kind of like future driven and where their life is going that they sometimes forget to that, like look into the past and actually try and reconnect with a lot of the things in the past, where I do think it's beneficial to kind of have a bit of time to look towards both, because they're both part of us, and somehow a lot of things we're experiencing right now might not be because of our kind of the fact that we're scared about the future. It might be because we have certain things we're holding on from the past that we need to let go of in order to kind of be able to progress in the future. So that theme of kind of looking back and being more reflective, being more introspective is a very kind of common theme, and I feel like it also encourages readers to also be more introspective about their own lives and relationships, which is not something that's like as encouraged nowadays. I feel it's almost like, oh, how to, you know, not give a damn, how to not care, all of that. It's very different to what the narrative is, I guess, in the current world. Other than these, like obviously I've talked about these in every single Murakami book, incredibly atmospheric, the way he describes the cafes and the settings, the bars, and then the constant use of music. I know that there are multiple playlists on Spotify that kind of detail all the music ever mentioned in his book. He even references the greatest hits request show on the NEB radio. The NEB radio comes back, I think, in or at least I think it comes back in IQ84. But anyways, the mention of radio, like I grew up listening to a lot of radio in the car with my family when we were going on road trips and stuff. So you can imagine, like for a lot of people, even the mention of like listening to radio on a kind of like a rainy evening, and someone's requesting these songs and you hear like familiar names, all of that is super nostalgic. In a way, all of these little things feel like little triggers that he's placed all over his writing and his books to like trigger this feeling of nostalgia and make us like feel like really warm and fuzzy, which I think if there's one thing he does really well, it's that. I want to end the video by reading one of my favorite chapters. It's just one page. It's chapter 30 and page 107. Here goes. There was a time when everyone wanted to be cool. Towards the end of high school, I decided to express only half of what I was really feeling. I can't recall the initial reason, but for the next several years this was how I behaved, at which point I discovered that I had turned into a person incapable of expressing more than half of what he felt. I don't know what that has to do with being cool, but if a fridge that had to be defrosted all year round can be called cool, then that's what I was. And so I continue writing this, plying my consciousness with cigarettes and beer to prevent it from sinking into the sludge of time. I take one hot shower after another, shave twice a day, listen to the same old records over and over again. In fact, the out-of-date sounds of Peter, Paul, and Mary are playing behind me right now. Don't think twice. It's all right. I feel like chapter 37 is also a really, really important piece that kind of can go quite unnoticed, because it's when the NEB radio host gets this letter and he reads it out, and it's from a girl who spends her days in the hospital. She can't really leave, but you know, she finds comfort in the music that he plays. And suddenly, you know, you get to learn about how when you are maybe standing, I don't know, near the beach or somewhere, and you're looking towards the city in the lights, and you can see like, oh, that's so beautiful, but each of those have so much story, so many stories behind them, and there's so much going on that we don't know. And I feel like this concept of like there's so much about life, that so much about people that we constantly encounter that we know nothing about, that it's almost important to kind of live with empathy and live with understanding, and kind of not expect people to always understand you, and not be okay with the fact that you're not going to understand everyone, and that, you know, people, things, time, it comes and goes, and that's kind of like a general, like, not to fight it but kind of flow with it. And that's where I want to leave this review. I hope you really enjoyed it. That's only first half of this book because it was his first novel. The second one is Pinball 1973, and I'm super excited to read this and get back to you with my thoughts on that. But if you enjoyed this, please leave a thumbs up, leave a thumbs up, and also go check out the other review of After Dark, which is possibly my favorite work of his, which I'll link somewhere here. But yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for joining. Subscribe, and I'll see you later. Bye.